welcome. I'm bringing Brooklyn in the house. Come on in.
Okay, cameras are speeding.
I started this show in 2009 with Brooklyn Savvy set in different living rooms. So the best way to celebrate 20 seasons is to bring it home. I wanted to create a safe space to have uncomfortable yet transformative conversations that move people, amplifying the voices of those who are underrepresented and who inspire positive change. I'm Toni Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Students know when teachers really love them and care about them, and that has a huge impact on their performance. Education is supposed to create options, access, and opportunities for students. However, things like zoning create barriers that block many out of a good education. I found New York City to be a very challenging place to get your child educated because the school in the neighborhood might not be high performing. So I eventually had to opt out and send my kids to Catholic school. I was disappointed in having to do that because I had to come out of pocket. But the school around the corner might not be a high-performing school. Good leadership in schools of marginalized communities is so important. Two brilliant leaders used their platform to try and change that.
But why don't you share with us the story around how your school got into such prominence, how you lifted it, or how your student lifted it?
Okay.
Right.
So it was January 2015.
Oh, remember the date.
It was Martin Luther King Day.
Oh,
yeah, so
right.
interesting, right? And I had hit a wall, literally.
I remember that. It was like your Jesus moment.
Yes.
Right. And we at Cornerstone understand what those moments are.
For full disclosure, I was tired. The weight of the world was on my shoulders.
Right.
So I'm a mother of a 14-year-old now. She's in high school. I have the responsibility of children who are in Brownsville, Brooklyn, who the media only seems to capture the negative stereotypes of what the community is, but never looks at the positive brilliance that exists. We were coming off of the death of so many Black men in America, and I had it was the second time before the story came out, which I'll share the story, that I had to apologize to the young men in my school for the fact that America didn't seem to acknowledge that they mattered. And I felt like my teachers had hit a wall. I felt like the parents weren't being involved. And so I was just tired. And I'm a faithful person, but in that given moment, I just felt like I was doing it alone, and although God had called me to be in that space, I didn't have 1 ounce of energy left to give.
You were at the end of your rope.
The rope was done. It was done. And so I went home, and I remember crying on the couch, and my mother said to me, "What's wrong?" And I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm gonna resign from my position. I took out my laptop, and she said, "No, you need to pray."
Good, right?
And yeah, it sounded good, but I told her no. Said I don't feel like praying, not today. And it was Saturday. I told her I would pray tomorrow at church. And she said, well, you know, God didn't bring you this far. He didn't allow you to have this testimony and to be in this space if he hadn't prepared you. And she said all the good things that a mother should say in someone who has faith in God, but at that given moment, I looked at her and I said, listen, I'm tired, and I just want to be a good mother to my daughter. I have given all that I can to everyone else's children. And so in this moment, I just need you to be that person who supports me and says it's okay. And she said, no, you're going to read Psalms. So she decided she was going to pray for me. The next day, I wanted to go to church, and I was dropping my daughter off to meet my basketball team, and it was pouring outside. And I looked at the coaches and I said, why are they outside? Why aren't they in cars? Aren't you going to a game? And they said they didn't have enough cars. And they all kept looking at me, and the boy said, Miss Lopez, can we get in your car? And I said, no, I got to go to church. And my daughter looked at me like, Ma, you going to let them be outside? I said, I was just crying. I need Jesus right now. And it was
just crying.
you know, and I ended up letting them get in the car. And so as we had to go to the belt, I passed my church and I said, see, I'm supposed to be there in service, but I'm here with y'all, right? So I was angry. The next day was Martin Luther King Day, and we literally had a leadership conference, and it wasn't for my kids, it was for just children at large throughout New York City. And there were over 300 children in the space. And because when you have negative energy, everything negative seems to follow in
Doesn't
suit.
it?
Yes.
Doesn't that's for, yes.
So I couldn't find any of the equipment, and then I couldn't find something, and I just felt
I feel like
like
you're being attacked a little
I
bit.
felt like, no, I was being attacked, and I said, oh, I'm gonna look foolish. So I went in my office and I literally prayed.
Good.
And I understood that you don't have to go to church as long as you're in right relationship with God, but I just needed a space with other, like I just needed my worship time. That's what I really needed. So I prayed and I apologized to God, and I told him that I was sorry for being angry and that I know he had a purpose for my life. And I was willing to be this obedient servant. And that whatever this was, that he was going to show me the purpose behind it, because he's never brought me anywhere this far without a purpose.
Right.
And that very evening, the Facebook post came on Humans of New York, which is, it's a popular blog. Within 24 hours of my scholar, Vidal Chasnet, who was walking down the street in Brownsville on Martin Luther King Day, he was asked who is the person who influences him, and he named me. That I, as his principal, had influenced him. I told my scholars that they mattered, that I don't suspend them, which is not true. I suspend them when they create unsafe situations, but I don't suspend especially our young black males if they're just being defiant because they need to be heard, or things that just require a good conversation or understanding the family dynamics, or just taking time to sit as a team to determine what we can do to help them. So in 24 hours, 1 million people liked the story, and then Brandon from Humans of New York came to the school because he found me on Facebook, and then found out that it wasn't just about me, but creating a space where there were these teachers who cared about kids and kids who really loved their environment. And he told that story, and it was the first time he had ever told a story within all of the stories that he had done. And then that's what led to me getting on Ellen, meeting the president.
And that led to the $1 million too.
And then we
right?
raised $1.4 million in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks.
In 2
and
weeks.
At one point in the story, you said it was a $1,000 a minute there for.
Right, so the last, I think it was, I don't know what day it was, but he said, I'm gonna put it online. I'm gonna put the time that I was talking to my scholars about how I felt broken and I felt like I was gonna give up. And the fact that they do matter to me and I love them. And as soon as he put that post up, it was $1,000 a minute.
Can you imagine? Right,
Yeah.
right, that is phenomenal. How did you, when you talk to your young black, African-American students, the boys, how do you talk to them about how they matter? Because I picked that up in what you just said. What do you say to get them to feel what they need to feel about themselves?
I don't think there's anything specific or special that I say. I speak to them like they're my children. There's kids know when you love them and when you don't.
Right.
And so I speak to them like human beings, and I pull them aside and I snatch them up sometimes and I give them hugs and I look them in the eyes and I say, I love you, but you're not acting right. Or I love you, and there's a world that thinks that you don't have value. And there's a pipeline that says the only place you're supposed to end up is in prison. And I need you to understand that we need you. And I remind them that they are young kings and there's a lineage of greatness within them, right? And I apologize. I apologize on behalf of those who didn't tell them that, who didn't show them more than the four corners of a project building. I apologize for that because someone was supposed to do that. And so it is my responsibility, because there were those who did it for me, to do it for our children and not make excuses and wait for somebody else to come save us. We do it for our own because we're the village.
Now, you're one person. How do you how does that message translate into the entire school in terms of the teachers that are actually impacting these students on a regular basis?
I say from the day I meet my teachers, like I'm not a gotcha person. I'm real clear on what my expectations are.
Nikole Hannah-Jones, who at the time covered school segregation for the New York Times, recently recognized for her documentary, The 1619 Project, spoke with the savvy panelistas to unpack the disparities in New York City's education system.
Talked about the New York City school system and how it's boutique integration and that it's integration that is curated. Talk to us about that.
Well, it's boutique curated integration for the white people in the district, and it's largely segregation in schools that are anything but boutique for most Black and Latino kids in the district. I mean, we have a city that is very diverse, and we're very proud of it being diverse, but a city can be at once diverse and segregated. We're the third most segregated city in terms of neighborhoods, and we're the largest, the most segregated large school system in the country. So we have a great deal of diversity, but Black children in particular are segregated in the lowest performing schools and in the poorest schools.
So what is driving that? I know it sounds obvious, but it might not be as obvious to some people.
I mean,
is it housing? What's causing it so that our kids are
there's a lot. It's a combination of a long legacy of housing discrimination from the federal government, state, local, down to private citizens, and then modern day discrimination. And also, I mean, frankly, what's caused it is white Americans don't want to send their children to school with large numbers of Black kids. So when desegregation was first even considered in the 1960s, you saw a great deal of white flight out of the city. And the white population that remains in the city wants to be concentrated in the handful of schools where their kids remain in the majority.
So are Black children stigmatized as in terms of education and their capabilities or abilities?
Is that a rhetorical question?
Well, a little bit. Can you speak to why?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, you don't build an entire country on the notion that Black people are inferior human beings, unworthy of citizenship rights in the country of their birth, and then have meaning for how we see children. If you look at
that was powerful what you just said, but keep going. Yeah,
I mean, white people in general, not just white people, even we do this in other communities of color, think that Black children are more violent. They think that Black children are less intelligent, less focused, that their parents are less engaged, or less somehow Black people are the only people on the face of the earth who don't value education. So you have all of these stereotypes where automatically the assumption is if the more Black kids a school has in it, then the more concerned a parent needs to be about whether their child will be safe or whether it'll be academically rigorous. So,
but hasn't your research indicated, though, that those schools that are integrated, both achievement gaps, I mean, the achievement scores go up?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Black children are not less intelligent.
Right.
They often are receiving less rigorous learning environments, and
Yes,
they're not
that
getting the
is true.
same opportunities as other children, but they're not less intelligent.
Right.
But it all drives each other. Once you have determined that Black children are less intelligent, then you don't give them the same resources as other schools, and then it becomes this kind of cyclical. Then you blame them for having low test scores, even though they don't have the resources to get high test scores, and you can say that you're avoiding schools because of test scores and not because of the color of the kids, even though you're actually avoiding the schools because of the color of the kids.
How does teacher placement factor into this whole dynamic?
I mean, what we know, and you can look in New York City, you can look in any community in the country, the more Black and brown kids in a school, the less likely they are to have a qualified teacher instructing them. They have the least experienced teachers. They have most likely to have long-term subs. So we have never in this country placed the best teachers into the schools with the poorest kids or with Black kids. I mean, this was actually one of the unintended consequences of school desegregation, was the loss of very, very highly qualified Black instructors who were teaching Black children. Now we tend to have the least experienced teachers and often not Black teachers at all teaching Black children.
Nikole, I love your work because what it does is really highlights the structure that supports everything that you're talking about. I mean, you really make it visible. When you talk about how the curriculum is different for Black children, when you talk about teacher equality and preparation and how that feeds this system. It supports this system that we're talking about. And so when you look at this kind of curation or parents choosing a school, all of those things are baked in.
Yes.
And it makes it very easy for people to make decisions around schooling that don't seem like they're about race or class, but they are absolutely supported by racism and by class structures in this country and in this city. And I think that's just one of the strongest points that we need to make and continue to have heard as we go out here to talk about how to change schools.
Absolutely.
But is the solution, because I read your article and your husband had one perspective and then you had the other, and if you could share that, because I think that dynamic is what happens with middle class Black people in New York City. If you could just describe what you two went through.
Right. So I was very determined that we were not going to use our privilege to get our daughter into one of the small number of integrated high wealth schools. That I thought it was important as someone who writes about these issues to also live my values and not just write about these values for other people. And frankly, I don't think my child is better than other kids. I don't think she deserves a better education. If you believe in public schools, you have to go into the public schools as they are. My husband had a very different feeling. I think a feeling that many Black middle class parents deal with and struggle with, which is we're one step out of poverty ourselves. We had to work very hard to get here. And it's very tenuous. And what the research shows is Black people have the highest chance of downward mobility, where
7
our
in 10, I
children,
think you said.
exactly, are much more likely to fall back down into a lower economic sphere than we are. So he was very concerned that the one benefit we could definitely secure for our child would be to get her into the best school possible. And I should make it clear, I don't feel like the burden of desegregation should be on Black middle class parents.
Okay.
We didn't cause the segregation. We don't want the segregation. It is not for us to undo. White parents who are able to pass every single advantage onto their children. I feel like, white parents who can pass every other advantage onto their children, they are the ones should actually bear the burden of desegregation.
But they're not going to.
No, and nowhere almost in the history of our country have white people willingly given this up. Where we've seen real desegregation, it's almost always been ordered by the courts, which is why we see very little outside of the South. But at the same time, I just believed that it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do as a human being who believes in equity. It was the right thing to do for my child. And if you live in a neighborhood with people, you shouldn't be afraid to send your children into school with them. I believe that.
I definitely, even though I leaned more to where your husband was, because of course you want the best for your child, but I also wonder, is it that we have abandoned sending our kids to the neighborhood schools, that the schools deteriorate? Is it for us to say, hey, we need to start really investing in these schools, those of us who can, to make the difference? I mean, is it the fact that our voices aren't there that is causing for all of this pain and struggle? That's just like a question I have, because it is people quickly, middle and upper middle class folks send their kids to these independent schools, parochial schools, whatever it is, to make sure that their child can get that education.
Yes.
But then we're leaving a lot behind, as you have said.
Right. So to be clear, segregated schools more likely than not harm the children who are in those schools.
Okay.
And what the research shows is that the longer a Black child is in a segregated school, the further he or she actually falls behind. So they might come in at a gap, but you would expect that the school would close that gap. But instead, segregated schools often exacerbate that gap. So I understand why
I'm thinking like
parents
HBCs, historically Black colleges.
A college is a different circumstance, right? Once you have managed to graduate from high school and you can choose that, we're talking about children who don't have a choice.
Absolutely.
Children who may not get the type of education that will even get them into college or help them to be successful in college. And we're also talking about largely a population that is working to lower class. This was also one of the unintended consequences of school desegregation. Brown v. Board of Education is prior to that, different social classes of Black people attended school together. You were isolated by race, but you were not isolated by economics. After Brown, of course, middle-class black parents who could escape to these other schools left, and what's
Yes.
left behind in our schools are schools that are not only entirely black, but also where almost every child is poor. And that clearly has a devastating impact on what happens inside the school.
No, I'm glad you. I'm sorry. I'm glad you brought up the brown as a kind of marker, because I've spoken to several people who were part of that desegregation movement, and there seems to be a common theme where they have all said that desegregation they saw as their downfall. That they
Yes, I hear that
were
all the time. Yes.
that they
Right.
were happier. They were better socialized. They were better educated when they had when the schools were segregated. Not that they had the equal resources, but they had teachers who cared about them. They had teachers who looked like them. They had people in the school systems that represented positions that they could achieve to, and that they didn't see that once they went into desegregated school systems. They went into hostile environments. They were taught by people who hated them and thought they couldn't achieve any better, and they said that they clearly thrived much better under the segregated systems that they had prior.
So I think we should always be very careful about looking back on the period of forced segregation with rose-tinted glasses.
Okay.
There were certainly some black schools where the children thrived. But overall, one, none of us would give up our right to be able to go and educate our children ourselves
Right.
wherever
Yes.
we want to go. But more importantly, the reason why they brought the challenge in Brown v. Board was that the vast majority of these schools were simply inferior in every way. In New York City, when you started to see white flight out of the city school system, you would have white schools that were under-enrolled, that had all of these resources, and black children were having to go to school for a half a day because they were so crammed into their schools, they couldn't fit all the kids. So black children were getting 4 hours of instruction to 8 hours of instruction to white children. And when they tested them, black children in New York were actually scoring worse on test scores than black children who were being de jure segregated in the South. So I don't think that any of us would want to go back to that. Yes, when the black community was forced to fend for itself, there were certain institutions, but that was because we had no choice. And those institutions were always in peril, they were always underfunded, and our children were simply not getting the same opportunities, because what this meant, the reason why the teachers were so excellent was because there were two professions you could have as a black person.
Right. Teacher, preacher.
You could be a teacher or a preacher. So you had folks who should have been nanoscientists, who should have been physicians, who should have been dentists, who should have been lawyers, who were teaching our children. Was that great for our children? Yes. Was that good for black people? No, it was terrible. We don't want to go back to that. So I think it's very easy to kind of romanticize that period, but the truth is, our people were demeaned by that period of legal segregation, and that's why they fought so hard against it.
So in New York City, now this might seem naive, but is this intentional? Is this meaning? Okay, why don't you talk? Yes, talk about the zoning. Talk about. Well, I wanted that to get out there, Brooklyn. Let's talk about school zoning and what that means, because you've had some experience with that, and I want my audience to understand that when the word zoning comes up, your antenna needs to rise. Because it needs to rise. So if you could talk to us about that, what you experienced with zoning in your daughter's school.
Think about the way our mayor, right? We are in a very progressive city with a very progressive mayor. When asked about the issue of school segregation, what he says is people bought houses into certain neighborhoods to get access to certain schools, and we don't have the right to mess with that. Except the ability to buy into those neighborhoods is because of a long legacy of housing discrimination that hurt black people in their ability to accumulate wealth that would allow them to buy into those same neighborhoods. So you are therefore entrenching school segregation because certain populations who have means will only ever buy into certain neighborhoods to get access to those schools.
You know, knowledge is power, and it would have been so good to have known a lot of these things back when I was sending my kids to school. Hope this episode was resourceful for our parents with school-age children, because you know we want to be resonant. Until next time, Brooklyn.